Howdy and welcome to the Strange West Podcast. This is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trentano. Bringing us in as always with their rendition of Eno Marconi's For a Few Dollars More is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like your guitar slingers and you like your gunslingers, then head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That's Mitch, Polzak.com. In tonight's podcast, the Cowboys Vs Nazi action continues in Chapter 23 of Paris High Noon by yours truly, Trentano. If you want to get your Cowboys vs. Nazi on, then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are available at Society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/Trentano. And as always, I'd like to give a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really brings Paris High Noon alive. So without further ado, here is Chapter 23 of Paris High Noon.
Chapter 23, Gunsmoke Sacrifice. Catfish and St. Jude watched from the ridge overlooking Morbois, one of the scores of small towns that ringed the outskirts of Paris. The afternoon sun marched across the main street, which rode straight into town, then straight out again towards Paris. Catfish watched it all through his binoculars, keeping his eyes on the few soldiers who were around to keep the occupied honest. St. Jude kept an eye on their backsides, just in case some wandering German or Frenchman stumbled upon them. St. Jude kicked at a stump. "It's been over an hour. What's taking Goose so long?" Catfish kept his eyes on the town. From time to time he would use his own eyes instead of the binoculars. "These things take time," Catfish said after a while. "Go down there yourself and start asking questions if you want. I'm sure the Boche will point you in the right direction." "I should be back at the hideout," St. Jude said. "It was stupid for both of us to come out here. If something happens to us, who's going to take care of Jean?" "Jean can take care of himself," Catfish said. "And what if he can't?" When St. Jude, Catfish, and Goose slipped out of Paris, they noticed a lot more patrols around the cemetery. Catfish put the binoculars down and looked at St. Jude. "When did you start giving a wet fart about Jean?" St. Jude tried to answer, but he couldn't find the right words. Words that would make him sound tough, yet loving. The kind of words the old cowboy used so often. Instead, he kicked the stump again. Nearby, a twig snapped. Catfish and St. Jude pulled out their guns. "A goddamn circus full of chimps could be more quiet than you two." Goose came up from a thicket of bramble. Catfish and St. Jude put their guns away. Catfish felt a little embarrassed. Goose had snuck up on him. The old cowboy didn't know if the street Apache was that good or if he was getting that rusty. "How many Boche in town?" Catfish asked. "Enough to keep you worried, but not enough to cause much trouble," Goose said. "There's a side street next to the doctor's office that runs up into the woods." Catfish got down from his perch. "All right, then. Goose, you stay here and keep an eye out. I'll take my fellow chimpanzee and go to the rendezvous." Goose gave a little chuckle and took up an overwatch. Catfish and St. Jude cut through the forest to the edge of town. The small alley twisted until it spilled out onto a cobblestone street where a few soldiers walked around while the occupied went about their business. The doctor's house was tucked away in a street 2 blocks up the corner. Up on the second floor, planter boxes held yellow daisies, adding color to the day. St. Jude went in first. An old nurse sat at a desk in a small waiting room. An elderly couple sat in a love seat next to the fireplace. A small man with big hands kept an eye on the front door. He pretended to read a newspaper in a sofa chair next to the window. Catfish walked through the door and tipped his hat to the nurse. The old nurse nodded her head and told the two to have a seat. Before sitting down, St. Jude asked the nurse where the latrine was. The nurse told him it was down the hall. He walked down the hall, checking the open doors. In the latrine, he opened up the window, looking up and down the street from the cover of the yellow daisies. St. Jude flushed, washed his hands, and sat back down with Catfish. giving the old cowboy a nod. About 10 minutes later, the nurse told Catfish to go up to the second floor, room 9. The door to number 9 was ajar. At the corner of the small examining room sat a mid-sized man in a big suit. "Good afternoon, doctor," Catfish said. The man smiled. "I'm not the doctor," he said, with a French accent that had confidence in its consonants but little passion in its vowels. Catfish's right hand went under his jacket. "So if you're not the doc, then who are you?" "I'm a jeweler," the man replied in an easy way. Catfish smiled. "That's good. I got some jewelry that needs a look at." Catfish pulled out Le Corbeau Rouge's brooch. The man reached out for it. He rolled it around in his hands, looking at the corners. Finally, he put it in his pocket and stuck out his hand. "Captain Bonney, British Special Operations Executive, the SOE." Catfish shook his hand. "William Catfish Hancock, American outlaw." "We've heard a lot about you over in London," Bonney said. "The way you and your gang robbed that bank in Argenton caught the notice of the Prime Minister." Catfish chuckled. "Well, I'll take that as a compliment. Unless, of course, Mr. Churchill wants a cut of the action." "The way you rob a bank, I'm sure he'll be interested," Bonney said. Catfish smiled. "Well, I do say I possess rare talents. Anywho, I could use a friend. God knows I got plenty of enemies." Bonney nodded. "We share the same enemies." Bonney motioned for Catfish to take a seat. "I just want you to know how much of a risk I'm taking in meeting you on short notice." "Well, I appreciate the bother." The SOE man leaned towards Catfish, speaking low. "My mission originally was to rendezvous with 3 resistance leaders in occupied France," Bonney said. "We were to meet a fortnight ago, but things went wrong," Catfish said. Bonney took in a breath. "I jumped in with 3 other men. One of them is in the waiting room. The other 2 didn't make it to our rendezvous. Neither did the resistors." "Well, that sounds like a bad spot of luck you got there." Bonney looked up at Catfish. "Before coming here, I got word from London that a train full of prisoners is headed to the other side of the Rhine. The man you're looking to bust out, Hucketier Nouveau, will be on it." Catfish leaned forward, his mustache sagging a bit at the edges. "How do you know that?" "Trade secrets, I'm afraid," Bonney replied. "Don't take it personally." Catfish leaned back in his chair. "I don't." Bonney took out a silk handkerchief. On the reverse side was a map of occupied France. "The train will leave around 8 o'clock, 2 nights from now. I was thinking of taking out the train here." Bonney pointed to a spot just outside of Paris. Catfish looked at the spot and shook his head. "I take it you SOE boys haven't learned to take down a train or run from the law." Catfish pointed at the map. "Too many towns close by. Grades on a downslope, and the terrain is as wide open as a preacher's mouth on a Sunday morning." Bonney was impressed. "Well, maybe I should leave the planning to you." Catfish pointed to a section of the track that skirted the Marne River along a narrow valley. "That's where we'll take them. Wait till the coaches are up on the bridge. That way the Boche won't be able to maneuver on us. We got a machine gun that will keep their heads inside. A few of us will go on top of the coaches and spring the prisoners. Of course, I don't know what coach is holding them." "Leave that to me," Bonney said. "We're also going to need horses." Bonney let a laugh escape and looked at Catfish, wondering if the old cowboy was serious. "Don't worry," Catfish said with a grin. "I'll take care of the horses. Are you and your pard going to be able to keep a saddle?" Bonney folded his arms. "I'll admit we're not seasoned in that regard, but we'll take on the task as any Englishman would." Catfish had a laugh at that one. "Well, hopefully this won't turn into a charge of the Light Brigade. Meet on the North Ridge overlooking Moue tomorrow night. After midnight. I'll have the horses there. How many men do you have? Bonnie asked. I can bring 7, including myself, to the party. Got plenty of pistols, bullet sprayers, and a few extra sticks of dynamite. We don't want to blow up the train. Catfish smiled. Don't worry. I'm a professor when it comes to holding up a train. Bonnie got up from his seat. Well, I guess that about does it for now. I'll make arrangements with London to have us picked up after the prison break. Ever been in a submarine? Nope. Then again, there are a lot of things I've done that I still can't believe I did. I guess I got one more surprise in store for me. Bonnie stuck out his hand. Catfish took it. There's one more thing I want to tell you, Bonnie said. It's about the man who's been hunting you. Catfish's eyes went hard around the edges. His name's SS Major Bartholomew Schwartz. He goes by the moniker Black Bart. The boys in London have done a background search on him. Seems like he was part of a Bavarian cowboy club around the same time you were on tour with Brazos Billy. Catfish thought about those decades. Gone past like so much water through a river. He concentrated on those gaslight cowboy days when he rode the Brazos Billy Wild West Show circuit through Europe. Mostly he remembered the ladies, but there were also a few hazy faces of chubby-cheeked kids. Was it one of them? He shook the notion out of his head. Catfish had to concentrate on other things. Do I leave first or should you? He said. Bonnie opened the door. Wait 30 minutes, then leave. I'll be waiting for you on the North Ridge. Catfish nodded. At the appointed time, Catfish went down to the waiting room where an anxious St. Jude sat on his hands. I thought that limey cocksucker did you in. Takes more than a smooth-talking gentleman to do me in, Catfish said. Although I will admit I've lost money that way. Do you trust these Englishmen? St. Jude asked. Well, I haven't met their mothers, but they seem all right to me, Catfish said. Besides, we got the same enemies, and sometimes that's enough for trust. Catfish and St. Jude waited another 10 minutes, then walked out of the doctor's office towards the north end of town, taking the same trail back to Goose. So, Goose asked, we good to go? Yep, Catfish said. Let's head back to Paris, boys. We got a long couple of days and nights ahead of us. As they turned back towards Paris, Catfish thought about the young boys he met on tour with Brazos Billy. Each one bright as a star and full of salt. No doubt life had beat those young boys down. Those who survived the Great War would have grown up far too quick. It reminded him of the change in Jean, how he'd taken to the horse, trail, and gun. Catfish couldn't interfere with John's choices, but hoped he'd managed to teach the boy one or two things that really mattered. Catfish was no Socrates, he just didn't want to let another boy down. It took longer than Jean expected to get back to the hideout. St. Jude had told him the markers to navigate by if he had to take a new route, but the tunnels twisted and switched back until he and Moue almost got lost trying to avoid the patrols. When they reached the old brewery, they were already 4 hours past their return. Barnaby was waiting for them by the campfire, sipping on coffee. Louis was in a corner taking a long pull from a wine bottle. Barnaby raised his cup. Thought you got snatched up by the Boche. Jean sat Moue next to the fire, poured 2 cups of coffee. They're out there, he said, crawling all over the place. Well, I'm glad you made it back, Barnaby said. I would hate to try to explain what happened to Catfish or your brother. Jean handed Moue a cup of coffee, but she waved it off. Her nerves was still frazzled from seeing Richard, and all the walking had tuckered her out. She just wanted to close her eyes and try to forget. But every time she did, Richard's face stared back. Jean took Moue's hand. Are you feeling well? Moue shook her head. I'm tired, that's all. Go, get some rest. When Catfish and the others get back, I imagine there'll be little time for sleep. Moue nodded and went to her little alcove behind the sheet. Jean turned to Barnaby. You and Louis go ahead topside. We're going to need as much of a scout as we can get before trying to break out Hiccup. Louis got up from his corner. The wine bottle was almost empty. Didn't you just say the place was crawling with the Boche? They're around the cemetery, but there's a tunnel that slips underneath them. Jean turned to Barnaby. Take the left fork on the north wall of the old brewery. Follow it for about 200 yards, and you'll pop up near the Jardin du Luxembourg. Barnaby put down his cup of coffee. You sure it's safe? Jean took a long pull from his own cup. Nothing and nowhere is safe for us. The only thing we can do is try and stay a couple of steps ahead of the Boche. Barnaby grabbed his coat. All right, we'll be back by sunup. Yeah, if the Boche don't catch us first, Louis said. Louis followed Barnaby down the tunnel. He waited until they got near the wall of bones and then pulled out his bayonet. Near the hole that led to the old brewery, Barnaby hunched down to get through. Louis sprang onto the big Norman's back, catching him off guard. He moved his big arms up, but they hit the low tunnel. Louis slipped the blade under Barnaby's throat. With a swift slice, the steel cut through Barnaby's windpipe. Blood sprayed the tunnel walls. Barnaby jerked back, heaving all his weight to his backside. He fell on top of Louis. Barnaby struggled to get up on all fours and was able to buck Louis off his back, but the wound was mortal. His big hands reached out for the retaining wall of bones, knocking it down and sending a spill of femurs and ribs onto him. Then Barnaby felt the warmth flow over him. The smell of the sea hit his nose like it did when the wind blew the Channel air over his farm. Louis got up. The floor was slick with blood. He picked up Barnaby's torch and had a look around. The big Norman had made a mess of things. Louis grabbed Barnaby by his boots and dragged him to the breach in the bone wall. He tried to roll the body into the gap, but he was only able to get it halfway in. Louis gathered up the spilled bones and piled them on top of the dead Norman. It was a half-assed job, but Louis didn't have the time to be concerned. By now, Jean and Moue were either sweating it up or sleeping separately. Louis figured on the latter. He took the bayonet back in his belt and made his way back to the old temple. Meanwhile, back at the hideout, Jean finished his coffee by the dying campfire. He debated throwing on a few more splinters of lumber, but figured it would go to waste. He wavered between calling out to Moue or turning over and going to sleep. He wanted to talk to Moue, to be with her like it was the cafe just hours before. That moment was the happiest Jean had been in a long time. He finally felt like a man around her. When he flashed his anger about his father, she had changed her tone right quick. Maybe that was the way women wanted to be talked to, not with kindness, but directness. It got the kind of results Jean wanted. He cursed whatever it was that spooked her and ruined their conversation. He wanted Moue to understand he would protect her, with his own life if need be. The only thing he wanted in return was for her to love him. To Jean, it seemed a fair bargain, even if the price was too high. He took in a deep breath, let it out, and got up. Jean cleared his throat and gave a gentle tap at the curtain. Are you okay, Moue? Oui. I know it's tough out there, Jean said, but it's going to be all over soon. You have to trust me on that. I know, Moue said. It's just that all of this has gotten to my nerves. My head won't stop hurting and I ache all over. I'll get you some aspirin, Jean said. He went back to the campfire and rummaged through all the crates, sacks, and bags, but it seemed the outlaws put more stock in curing their ills with booze than with bona fide medicine. There's no aspirin, he said, but I can go topside and get some. Moue's throat felt like she just swallowed a horseshoe. If Richard or one of his crew got her note, the Germans would be on their way now to take them in. If they found Jean, he would endure worse than what she got at the hands of the Nazis. They would kill him, and she'd have herself to blame for it. Maybe, she thought, if she kept Jean away from the hideout, they would come while he was gone and he could escape. Okay. It was the only word she could croak out. Jean put his hand on the curtain, and it started to tremble. "I'll be back," he said. "Don't worry." Louis was 100 yards from the hideout when he heard someone coming. He ducked in a cut along the tunnel and held the bayonet close to his side. The weak light of an electric torch grew closer and closer. Jean passed by, and Louis did nothing. He let the Nazis deal with the boy and the rest of them. Moue was alone. Louis could finally take his time. Moue heard footsteps coming into the hideout. She was hoping Jean would be gone longer, giving her a chance to sneak up and find Richard. She'd remembered how he said he only wanted the old cowboy, so maybe she could plead for Jean's life. Moue knew Jean would never forgive her, but at least he would be alive to hate her. It seemed strange, but being with Jean up at the cafe was the safest she'd felt since Paris fell. She was so close to confessing. Jean brought a credible amount of doubt to her mind about Richard. Maybe, she thought for a moment, she had found a way out. Then she saw Richard. He always told her that he was watching, even if Moue never saw him. The footsteps grew closer. "Jean?" Moue asked through the curtain. Louis tore the curtain away. In the dying glow of the campfire, she could see the bayonet clenched in his red right hand. "What do you want?" Moue asked him. "Be nice," Louis said, "or I'll gut you and leave you down here to die with the rats gnawing on your insides." Moue stood up and turned to run. Louis grabbed her arm and threw her towards the campfire. Moue scrabbled to her backside. Louis crept closer. Moue backed up towards the fire, pushing with her feet and pulling with her hands along the old temple floor. "Go ahead. Scream if you want," Louis said. "I prefer it if you do." "Get the hell away from me." "I wonder how much you'll be worth." "I don't know if the Boche are interested in you, but I'll keep you alive just in case. You're worth something. If not, I'll get my money out of your cunt." Moue tried to get up. Louis kicked her and she fell on her belly. Moue winced at the pain. "Let me go." Louis's laughs echoed in the temple. "You think that brat is going to come riding to the rescue? By the time he and that old fart come back, the Boche will be waiting for them. And after they string him and the rest of those fucks up on the Eiffel Tower, I'll have you all to myself." Louis grabbed her by the hair and pulled her head back. Moue cried out. Snot filled her nose and her throat began to close. Louis put the blade of the bayonet right up against the red scarf. Louis leaned close to Moue's ear. His whispers were hot and wet. "Maybe the Boche will let me gut that cunt-struck boy of yours. Maybe I'll let you watch." Louis twisted Moue onto her back. He sat on her stomach, leaning his left arm across her chest. The tip of the bayonet pierced her blouse, ripping skin and cloth until her upper body was torn and bloody. "Or maybe I'll keep him alive and let him watch me cut those pouty lips off your face." Moue squirmed under him. Louis hit her across the face, drawing blood around the corner of her mouth and nose. He put the bayonet back over her throat. Moue tried to turn her neck away from the blade, but it was no use. Louis dug his elbows into Moue's chest and leaned forward. Moue could feel and hear her ribs creak and pop. Moue closed her eyes. her fingers stretched out like cat claws, tearing at the rapist's exposed flesh. She squirmed her hips and legs, trying to get enough leverage to buck him off. Tears streamed out of Moue's clenched eyes. Bubbles of snot percolated from her nose. Louis struck Moue with an open hand across her face. The girl still continued to claw and squirm, almost succeeding in throwing Louis off of her. Louis was used to women fighting back, but holding down Moue was like holding down a mountain cat. "Fuck all this," he said, standing up. "Your cunt ain't worth fucking." He raised his bayonet over his head. Moue stopped struggling. Her body was exhausted. She wished she could see Jean one more time and tell him she was sorry for everything. A voice called out from the darkness. "Get away from her." Louis turned. In the flickering light of the fire stood Jean, about 20 yards away. The bayonet shook in his hand, while the rock-steady palm of Jean's right hand held the pistol. The two slowly circled each other. "Come back already?" Louis said. He turned a glance to Moue. "I bet you never fucked her, did you? Are you so used to sucking that old man's prick that you can't get it up for a woman?" The rapist's lips curled in a cruel smile. "Maybe I'll let him suck me off before I take his head to the Boche." Jean's chest rose and fell from deep breaths, with the gun firm in his palm. When he got to the bone wall, he'd noticed the stench of a fresh kill and saw Barnaby's boots sticking out. He rushed back to the hideout just in time. "You know how this is going to end," Jean said. Louis snarled. "You stupid brat. You think you're some gun-toting badass? You don't know shit about the world. But don't worry, I'm going to teach you. I'm going to gut you like the cunt you are. Then I'll make you watch me have my way with your precious cunny-lipped whore. Louis didn't have a chance to finish. Flash and powder filled the forgotten temple with the smell of sacrifice. The report echoed off the limestone walls and down into the catacombs. Moue looked on as Louis staggered from the impact to his chest and then dropped to his knees. She muttered Jean's name as he walked over with the smoking pistol in his hand. He pointed it right between Louis's eyes and cocked the hammer back. The glow of the campfire lit up Jean's eyes. "Jean!" In another roar of light, the rapist was gone forever. The report and Moue's scream echoed through the guts of Paris.
And welcome back to the Strange West Podcast. Once again, this is your host and word hustler extraordinaire, Trentano. Well, that about does it for tonight's Cowboys vs. Nazi action in Chapter 23 of Paris High Noon. Can't wait to find out what happens next? Then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Can't wait to find out what happens next? Then head on over to ParisHighNoon.com. Both paperback and ebook are available at ParisHighNoon.com. Don't forget that Paris High Noon t-shirts, sweatshirts, and other swag are available through Society6.com/Trentano. Both Paris High Noon and the Mustache t-shirts are available at Society6.com/Trentano. And as always, a big thank you to James K. Doyle for lending us his time and his talent to the podcast. He really does bring Paris High Noon alive. And sending us out, as always, with their rendition of Eno Mariconis for a few dollars more is the mighty Mitch Polzak and the Royal Deuces. If you like what you hear, then please head on over to MitchPolzak.com. That about does it for tonight's podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Until then, happy trails.